Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on most of the major podcast platforms, and we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. My guest for this four-part series is Rachel Friars. Rachel is a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'll be speaking with Rachel about her PhD topic, neo-Victorianism and 19th century lesbian literature and history, and how she uses primary resources to support her work. Rachel's other interests include life writing, historical fiction, true crime, popular culture, and the Gothic. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM. In this first episode, we meet Rachel as she catches us up on her current research and the importance of archives and primary sources in her work. Okay, Rachel, well, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Sure. So why don't we start by, if I could ask you just to give us a brief overview of your current research and what you're doing?
Absolutely. So I'm working on my dissertation right now, my doctoral project, and my dissertation looks at historical fiction by and about lesbian women from the years 1998 to 2022. So published around that time, but set in the 19th century. And I'm really building on recent work on lesbian historical fiction that suggests that this genre is very generative and revolutionary because it has this potential for rethinking lesbian attachment in contemporary public contexts. So to me, lesbian neo-Victorian fiction, by which I mean lesbian historical fiction set in the 19th century, has become this definitive subgenre in the last 20 years, so after 1998. So I begin with Sarah Waters' early neo-Victorian novels, and then I focus on more recent texts by authors like Emma Donoghue or Emily Danforth to suggest that writers return to the 19th century in order to reclaim this queer history through narrative. So they're actually writing back to both a tradition established by Sarah Waters in the 90s, but also to the long 19th century and to some of the narratives about queer life and lesbian life that get built up and established through various discourses in that period.
Mm-hmm. So, why don't you tell us about your experience using primary sources in your research, and how they've come into your work most recently?
Yeah, so archives are really crucial in several areas of my research because the fiction I work on focuses on adapting or reconsidering aspects of the 19th century. So it's important to return to the lived experience of that period through archives. And I think they provide one of the best avenues to really do that in really specific or focused detail. So, for example, I might choose to return to scans of early editions of sexologist publications on sexual deviance or difference in order to really determine exactly where and how lesbians in the 19th century were pictured or codified, and then how lesbian authors in contemporary fiction are then rewriting that narrative. Most recently, primary sources have figured in my work with my research on the diaries of Anne Lister. So Anne Lister, who was born in 1791, she died in 1840, was a prolific diarist with an archive of millions of words that detail every aspect of her daily life, including, and most importantly for me, her romantic relationships with several women. So I'm just generally fascinated by her life and her writings for a lot of reasons, but she figures into my larger research project because her life and diaries have recently been adapted into a 2-series television show called Gentleman Jack. And that falls directly into my purview of reassessing the lesbian 19th century through historical fiction. But in this case, the show is doing this work that I argue is so significant as to establish an entire subgenre. They're doing it with the real archives of a 19th century lesbian woman. So I returned to those archives of the scanned diaries in particular to assess what and how they're being adapted. And I also want to consider, just as importantly, what's being left out of those episodes of television that really work with the diaries. So what's not there, because if there are millions of words where you have to leave things out, you have to cut things out. And so I think that's just as crucial as what actually ends up in the show, because we're literally reinterpreting her for a contemporary audience. So I find that tension really fascinating, and archives and the Lister diaries are crucial for that, for assessing that relationship.
Right. That's I'm glad you said that. Because I wanted to ask you as a follow-up, like, what are some of the things you've sort of found in comparing actual queer history in this period with sort of the fictional portrayals of it in setting, sort of that sort of neo-Victorian kind of setting?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think at the more general level, and thinking through like medical pathologization of lesbian life, you get a lot of really negative portrayals, of course, because the Victorians are really interested in establishing a norm and a normative conception of bodies and pleasures in life. And so in order to do that, they very quickly reach for what is not normal and what is deviant in order to define themselves against it. And so it becomes really paradoxical in that one cannot exist without the other. So there's a lot of writing on, why and how a woman might turn toward lesbianism, or she might be seduced, or, watch out for your daughters, et cetera, et cetera. And so, of course, contemporary lesbian historical fiction is trying to suggest how patently untrue and how fiction-based a lot of those assessments are. So they're doing that through developing fully formed lesbian characters, developing relationships and desires that are in contrast to some of the strictures of the 19th century and 19th century gender binaries, which are hugely significant for defining the domestic and public roles of people in this period. So that's really huge. With the Lister diaries, I can be a little bit more specific and more positive, because the Lister diaries are her own words, her own experiences, and they're very specific, very graphic. So what's being adapted there is pretty much what's in the diaries. So if there's any sex or sexuality in the show, it's being adapted directly from the diaries and her own words and her own way of conceiving of who she was, because she was a very introspective person. And so I think that one of the through lines between the show and the diaries is this search for identity, which I think is something anyone can relate to, whether you were born in 1791 or born in 2001. So I think that that theme is really highlighted. And so the diaries have an interesting task in that they have to choose what to adapt, but often it gets to be something that's not, it is implicitly reacting against some of the negative narratives of pathologization, because it has to be in its positive portrayal, but it's so grounded in the actual archive, which I think is what's fascinating about it.
Right. So kind of following on that, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of archives in your area of research? What do they bring to your research in that sense?
Absolutely. And this question, I think, is near and dear to my heart. I think archives are hugely important to my research, which I would qualify as queer studies, and maybe more specifically lesbian literature and history, because I think queer people generally live in search of a queer history. And so for me, going back as far as I can to see how and where we were represented, especially when I can see that representation firsthand, as opposed to the medical or legal representations that pathologize the queer body into something to be regulated or defined against. So it's vital to see firsthand the way queer people perceive themselves, because it establishes both a sense of contemporary identity, as I was talking about, but also for reassuring these queer communities that we've always been here, we've never been anywhere else. And in some ways, there's nothing modern about queer communities. And I feel like that's a bit contradictory, but because we've always been here and we've always found a way to connect and survive, I think that archives have a fabulous way of showing that, because it can show us the way that, 200 years ago, we were connecting and surviving in much the same way as we are today. Mm-hmm. And there are more and more archival collections that are coming out now that reflect this survival and connection. So I really think that archives are like no other method of encountering history, and they're especially crucial in queer studies for exactly that reason, for encountering queer history.
Excellent. Nice. So, question about primary and secondary sources. I mean, where or how do you typically differentiate between using primary sources versus secondary sources in your work? I mean, I'm wondering if you can explain how you tend to use each type in your research and sort of the decision making behind that. Like when is an archive most useful to you versus when you might pull in a secondary resource?
This is a really great question, because I think it forced me basically to consider this in terms that I really had never considered before, because I think secondary sources and primary sources are I use them both in an effort to provide context and in an effort to support or provide analysis, but I think they do have to be treated differently, at least in my writing, and I think in any kind of like self-respecting historian or scholarly work, because they're designed differently. So criticism or history books or whatever we consider that secondary voice, they're crafted for a specific audience. They make a case for something that I might agree with or not agree with. And they have a kind of like self-reflexive critical context into which they're written, meaning that they're referencing other things that have been addressed around their specific topic. But primary sources are a lot more obscure in that respect. So usually they're not written for somebody else to see with someone else's eye in mind, and let alone someone else's historical moment. So they do require a different approach, because they might have that kind of argumentative voice, that kind of, this is my opinion and here's why I think this, but they might not support it at all. They might just believe that to be true. And they might require a kind of reaching outward to figure out, well, what's happening at this time that would influence this belief. So I feel like primary sources require the kind of detective work that is already done for you sometimes in secondary sources. And so for me, that's extremely fun, because you get to, it's definitely taxing, but you get to come to your own conclusions in many cases about archives and primary sources. But I think that in my own work, primary sources appear maybe in a comparative context. So thinking about Lister, thinking about the diaries, here's what's happening in the show, here's where the diaries meet that in terms of time or the episode that's being reflected. But they also might just be there to say, this aspect of Lister's life is directly pulled from the diaries because we know that she believed this about this particular thing. And then there's more explanation that has to come alongside that, and it might involve engaging with other critics who have spoken about Lister, or just more archives, more documents that, it's the rabbit holes are dangerous in archives, but that's what makes them so much fun.
Exactly. Nice. Okay. You just heard from Rachel Friars, a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Join us next week as Rachel describes the importance of the diaries of Anne Lister and her work, the utility of AM's Sex and Sexuality Digital Archive, and why primary sources demand a slower pace. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM.
She started writing these diaries, and they become more prolific, more sophisticated as she writes, as she grows up. And she was writing right up until her very sudden death in 1840. So those diaries are enormous. The archive is enormous, millions of words. And she wrote those diaries with the impression that she didn't want anyone else to read them. So most of them, especially her lesbian relationships, are written in code. It's her own private code. She designed it. And for a long time, no one could figure it out. And for a long time, diaries were actually hidden. So the code is really interesting because it provides a veil or a layer through which we have to actually work through in order to understand what those diaries are saying.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.